When I came back from a short trip, I saw my bags dumped outside with a note that read, "If you want to stay here, start paying rent like everyone else." No signature, no warmth. Just 7 words scribbled in my daughter-in-law's sharp, unmistakable handwriting, left beneath a rock on top of my weekend bag, as if that note hadn't just shattered decades of motherhood in one cruel stroke. I stood there on the porch I once swept every spring, my name no longer welcome where I once rocked babies to sleep and fed hungry mouths at my kitchen table. That porch, that home, that family, it all looked the same, but something inside it had turned completely unrecognizable. Welcome to Shame's Stories, where the silence of forgotten mothers and mistreated women finds its voice. If you're listening today, I ask that you stay with me, especially if you've ever been dismissed, replaced, or told you were no longer useful in the life you built. And while you're here, let me gently ask, where in the world are you listening from? Share that with us, because these stories, though personal, are not rare. And if this one touches something in you, I invite you to subscribe and walk this journey with me. Let us remember together that even when we are thrown away, we do not have to disappear. Now close your eyes and picture this. You've just returned from a weekend of helping an old friend settle into hospice care. Your feet ache, your heart is heavy, and all you want is the comfort of your home, your chair, your books, a warm bath. But instead of welcome, you're met with silence. Your house key no longer fits, and on the ground is everything you own. That's the moment I realized I had been quietly evicted, not from a house, but from the role of mother in my son's eyes. My name is Ruth. I'm 72 years old, widowed for nearly 9 years now, and I live, or I used to live, in a small, aging bungalow on the outskirts of Vermont. I was a teacher for 36 years, then a grandmother full-time after retirement. The kind who packed school lunches, paid for braces, offered rides, and never once asked for anything back. I raised my son, Daniel, in that home. Every corner of it bore his fingerprints. His baby photo still hung on the wall, his height etched into the doorframe of what used to be his bedroom. And though he grew up, married, and brought his wife into that same house, I never stopped thinking of it as our family's heart. But apparently, I was the only one who still felt that way. Daniel's wife, Harper, entered our lives 5 years ago. A woman of expensive taste and short patience, she wore motherhood, like a trend, and compassion, like a costume. At first, I tried to accept her. She was Daniel's choice, and though her sharp tongue made me flinch, and her constant sighs at my stories cut deeper than she knew, I stayed quiet. I didn't want to be that kind of mother-in-law, the meddling one, the bitter one, the one who couldn't let go. So I smiled through the tension and gave space even when it hurt. I even offered to sign over partial ownership of the house to Daniel, thinking it would help him feel secure, provide a sense of investment, of legacy. Walter, my late husband, had warned against it. A home isn't just a building, he once told me. It's the people who care what happens inside of it. But I didn't listen. I wanted peace more than power. I wanted them to feel welcome. That decision, I now understand, was the first brick in my own undoing. A week before the note appeared, I had driven down to Connecticut to sit with my oldest friend Janice, who had just been placed into hospice after a long fight with ovarian cancer. She had no children, no siblings left, and she had asked me to help her organize her affairs. I didn't hesitate. I left Harper a note on the fridge, letting her know I'd be back Sunday. I even stocked the fridge, tidied the bathroom, and left the heating instructions written out like I always did. That house was still my home, even if I had begun to feel like a tenant in it. But when I returned that Sunday evening, the house was dark. The front light was off. My key no longer worked. And there, at the foot of the porch steps, were 3 bags, one of them gaping open, with my nightgown spilling onto the damp wood. The note sat squarely on top. The ink had smudged slightly from the dew, but the message remained crystal clear. If you want to stay here, start paying rent like everyone else. I stood there, heart racing, my hand still gripping the useless key, too stunned to cry. I rang the bell. No answer. I knocked. Still nothing. The curtains remained drawn. No footsteps. No explanation. I tried calling Daniel. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Still nothing. It was as if I had become a stranger overnight. And standing in that silence, all I could think about was the years I had poured into that house, into that child, into making sure everyone else had what they needed. How I had stretched grocery budgets to afford Daniel's piano lessons. How I had sat beside Harper in the hospital after she miscarried. How I had cleaned and cooked and filled the gaps without ever once being asked. I had given my entire self to this family, and now I was being asked to pay rent, to earn my place. I drove to a roadside inn 15 minutes away, tears finally falling once I locked the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed in that stale-smelling room, clutching the wrinkled note like it held some answer I was too numb to understand. The betrayal wasn't just sudden. It was orchestrated. They had waited until I was out of sight, made the house legally theirs through a quiet signature I had offered in good faith, and then stripped me of every remaining right to call it mine. The next morning I returned, not to plead, but to retrieve what I could. Harper opened the door wearing silk pajamas and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She stepped aside as if I were a guest, not the woman who had raised the man she now slept beside. "You said you'd be gone for days," she remarked, as if I had violated some contract. "Daniel and I had a long talk while you were away. It's time we have boundaries." I remember asking, "So you think charging me rent is setting a boundary?" She folded her arms and replied, "You live here. You use the utilities. You contribute nothing. We just want fairness." It was then I understood. It had never been about space or privacy or utility bills. It was about control, about reclaiming a home that had never felt like hers, and pushing out the one person who reminded her of that fact. Daniel, when he finally appeared at the top of the stairs, couldn't even look at me. I left with my belongings, but I did not leave with shame, because something inside me had shifted. They thought they could unmother me, unhouse me, unwrite the years I'd sacrificed. But I still had one thing they never imagined I would use: my memory. And within that memory were the choices I made, the sacrifices I kept quiet, and the proof of what this family had truly become. I wasn't going to beg, but I was going to uncover the truth and remind them that the person they tried to discard was not the same woman who had left for that short trip just days before. The morning after I was exiled from my own porch, I sat in the stiff-backed chair of a motel room with a floral bedspread and curtains that smelled like old detergent. The air was dry, the heater clanged every 30 minutes, and the ticking of the cheap plastic wall clock sounded like a slow, deliberate reminder that time was passing. And with it, the life I had spent decades building. I opened my overnight bag and unfolded my nightgown, smoothing it on the bed like it was a fragile artifact from a different life. I kept replaying that note in my mind, those ugly words scribbled by Harper's hand, and I couldn't help but ask myself, how did it come to this? How did I, Ruth, mother and teacher and widow and woman who never said no, end up locked out of her own house like some beggar at the door? To understand the present, I had to go back. Not just to the trip I had taken or the signature I'd offered, but to the beginning. Back to the life I had built from the ground up. Back to when Daniel was still my little boy, clinging to my leg at the supermarket, always asking 1,000 questions about clouds and stars and frogs. Back to when Walter was alive, strong and humming Sinatra while he painted the picket fence white every spring. Ours was not a grand life, but it was full. We lived simply within our means in a home we purchased in our early 30s. A modest 3-bedroom with creaky floors and a yard full of wildflowers. Walter was a mechanic, quiet and steadfast, and I taught literature at the local high school. We didn't take vacations often, didn't go out to dinner much, but we had everything that mattered. And when Daniel came into our lives, our only child, after 3 miscarriages, we treasured him with a quiet reverence that often kept us up at night just watching him breathe. He was a sweet boy, clever and observant, Sensitive, too. He used to make me handmade cards just because. And he cried when the neighbor's dog died. I worried that the world would be too harsh for a boy like him. So I did everything I could to shield him, to prepare him, to make him strong. Perhaps too much. Looking back now, I wonder if I protected him so well that he never learned to protect me. He adored his father. Walter taught him how to change oil, fix a leak, sharpen a kitchen knife. When Walter passed, Daniel was 24 and still figuring out who he wanted to be. Walter had collapsed in the garage one Saturday afternoon, a sudden heart attack that came without warning. The silence that followed his death was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The house was quieter. Daniel became more distant. And I, newly retired, began to throw myself into routines that masked the grief. Morning walks, church, volunteering, even starting a little tutoring group at the library just to keep busy. I wanted to be useful. I wanted to feel needed. Daniel eventually moved out and rented an apartment not far from us. He was working in IT, had a steady paycheck, and started dating again after a long and messy breakup. That's when he met Harper. From the first moment I shook her hand, I felt the chill. She was polished, that much I could say. Well-dressed, confident, and never rude, but never quite present either. She never asked questions, never seemed to care about our family stories or traditions. When I invited her to bake pies with me for Thanksgiving, she showed up 2 hours late with store-bought pastries and said she was not really into flour and elbow grease. She didn't insult me outright. She didn't have to. Her disinterest was loud enough, but Daniel glowed around her. He laughed in a way I hadn't heard in years. So I told myself to be gracious. I told myself to accept her. I smiled and offered second helpings. I nodded when she said she wanted to renovate every room in her future home, even though she hadn't seen ours yet. I bit my tongue when she suggested we consider condensing our furniture so things felt less grandmotherly. When they got married, they asked if they could move into the house with me, just for a year, to save for a place of their own. It made sense, Daniel said. Why pay rent elsewhere when we had extra bedrooms going unused? I hesitated, but in the end, I said yes. Because I missed him. Because I wanted to know my future grandchildren. Because saying no felt selfish, even if something inside me whispered not to do it. At first, it was manageable. Harper kept to herself, mostly upstairs. Daniel worked long hours, and I did what I always did. Cooked, cleaned, stayed out of the way. I made sure dinner was ready. I gave them space. I let them be adults. But slowly, things shifted. Harper began to claim spaces. The family room became her yoga zone. My reading chair was removed to make space for modern pieces. She brought in a decorator without asking and told me we should freshen things up now that they were a young couple building a life here. Daniel said nothing. When their lease ended and they didn't move out, I didn't say anything either. Instead, I told myself that family shared homes, that generations could coexist, that my discomfort was temporary, that Harper would come to see me not as a burden, but as an ally. But that never happened. One night, Harper brought up the idea of formalizing ownership. Just for security, she said, in case something ever happens to you. Daniel sat beside her, silent but expectant. I felt the pressure, gentle, smiling, but undeniable. And so, against every instinct, I agreed to add Daniel's name to the house. Not because I was ready to give it away, but because I wanted to believe that giving it freely would mean I could stay, that my presence would still matter, that being generous would buy me safety. But generosity does not protect you from people who believe your usefulness has an expiration date. From that moment on, the changes became bolder. Harper stopped saying good morning. My mail started arriving later and later, if it showed up at all. The thermostat was adjusted without my input. My bedroom door was found open when I knew I had shut it. And then came the little humiliations. The casual jokes about me being out of touch. The eye rolls when I brought up Walter's name. The sudden exclusion from dinner reservations or family planning. When Harper miscarried a year later, I was the one who sat with her in the emergency room. Daniel was stuck at work, she said. I held her hand. I rubbed her back. I told her she wasn't alone. She cried in my arms. For one moment, I thought perhaps that would change something, that we would be bound now, even slightly, by that grief. But as soon as she healed, the wall returned, and this time it was taller than before. I found out from a neighbor, yes, a neighbor, that Daniel and Harper had quietly consulted a real estate attorney about something called a survivorship clause. They were seeking full transfer of the house in the event of my death or incapacitation. I confronted Daniel. He looked pained but said, Harper just wanted to be proactive. That this was about protecting the future, but no one was protecting me. I began keeping my documents in a locked drawer. I made copies of the house deed. I updated my will. But still, I stayed. Because it was my home. Because the memories of Walter were soaked into the walls. Because I didn't want to lose what I had built over a lifetime. And so, when I left for that trip to Connecticut to help Janice, my last friend from college, I didn't imagine they would use my absence as an opportunity to evict me from my own story. I thought, just maybe Harper would soften, that Daniel would see how loyal I had been, that kindness would mean something. But I was wrong, and as I sat in that motel room, surrounded by everything I owned, reduced to 3 bags and a wrinkled nightgown, I knew one thing for sure. They may have tried to erase me, but I still remembered everything. I never imagined that a note, 7 words scribbled without care, could echo louder than a lifetime of love. But it did. In that motel room, with peeling wallpaper and a heater that rattled like bones in a drawer, I realized I had entered a new stage of grief, not just over Walter's death, which still sat in my bones like winter frost, but over something more brutal, being alive while your own child rewrites you out of his life. That kind of grief didn't come with casseroles or condolences. It came with silence, stinging silence, the kind that whispers you no longer matter, and worse, that your usefulness is an inconvenience now. I sat up most of that first night, watching the red digits of the motel clock crawl forward, sleepless not from fear, but from shame. It wasn't shame over what I had done, because deep down, I knew I had done nothing wrong, but the shame of letting them do this to me without resistance. For years, I had bent to Harper's moods, tiptoed around her cold silences, swallowed comments that should have been confronted. I did it for Daniel, or so I told myself. I believed, in my naivety, that patience would eventually soften her, that being kind would win me a place at the table she clearly wanted to set without me. But now, that same patience had become a noose they pulled tighter every time I gave in. The next morning, I drove to the public library, not the one I used to work in, but one in the next town over. I wanted anonymity. I wanted a space where no one would recognize me as the woman whose son had locked her out. I sat at a corner desk and began searching, quietly, deliberately, for legal terms, homeowner rights, survivorship clauses, and anything else I could think of that might unravel what Harper and Daniel had done while I was away. I didn't have a lawyer yet, and truthfully, I didn't know if I could afford one. But I had 36 years of teaching experience, and a mind that had once helped hundreds of students navigate Shakespeare, Emerson, and Toni Morrison. If I could teach a teenager to dissect metaphors, I could teach myself to read legalese. That day, I learned more than I expected. I discovered that, depending on how the deed was written, and especially if I had unknowingly signed a joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, I may have legally surrendered the entire property. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Could it be that my own name, the one etched into every memory of that house, no longer carried legal weight within its walls? But then something struck me. I remembered an envelope I had stored in the fireproof box beneath the stairs, one I hadn't opened in years. It was from Walter. He had written it after he was diagnosed during a particularly quiet evening when we had sat on the porch and spoken not of death, but of what would happen after. I remember him handing it to me and saying, "Keep this safe. Don't read it unless you need to. And if I'm not around, Ruth, trust yourself." It had never seemed urgent, but now It pulsed in my mind like a light, calling me home. The only problem was, I no longer had a key to the house. I returned to the motel and made a decision, not out of desperation, but out of calculation. I would go back, not to reclaim my space, but to retrieve what was mine. If they were going to corner me with paperwork and twisted interpretations of generosity, then I would meet them with truth. Walter's truth, my truth. The next morning, I arrived when I knew Harper would be at her Pilates class. She posted about it religiously. Wellness Wednesdays at the same studio downtown. Daniel's car wasn't in the driveway either. He usually left early. I parked a block away and approached the house slowly, heart pounding. I had lived there for over 40 years. Yet in that moment, it felt like trespassing. I knocked once just in case. No answer. I used the side entrance where the lock was older. To my disbelief, the key I had hidden under the planter, my last secret, still worked. The house was cold inside, not from temperature, but from energy. The furniture was sleeker now. My floral curtains had been replaced with beige panels. Even the smell was different. No cinnamon, no lavender from my drawers, just something sterile and vaguely citrus, like a showroom that had never been lived in. I moved quickly. I went to the coat closet where the fireproof box had always lived, hidden behind a panel of stacked board games. To my surprise, it was still there. My name was still on the tag. I opened it right there on the floor. There it was. Walter's envelope, yellowing slightly at the edges, but intact. I held it to my chest and left without touching anything else. Not a photo, not a spoon, not even the quilt I had sewn myself. Back at the motel, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and another envelope with official-looking documents. The letter, written in Walter's slanted handwriting, began, "My Ruth, if you're reading this, I am no longer beside you, and that thought alone breaks my heart. I've watched how you've carried this family. I've seen the way you give without asking, and how sometimes even I took it for granted. I want you to know that I never doubted your strength. That's why I did what I did. I had the original deed reviewed. I had a quitclaim form drawn up, one that restores the house to you alone. I never filed it because I trusted Daniel, but I'm leaving it here in case things go wrong. Trust your gut, Ruth. If you feel something is off, it probably is. This home is yours. It always has been." My hands trembled as I pulled out the legal form. It was dated, signed, notarized. Walter had taken steps I never knew about. Out of protection, out of love, out of faith in me. He had left me a rope in a dark well, and I had found it just before the water reached my mouth. The next day, I booked a consultation with a local attorney. Her name was Mallory Pierce, a young woman in her 30s with a fierce mind and eyes that understood things before they were spoken. I showed her everything, the current deed, the new document, the note, the circumstances. She listened, never interrupting, and when I finished, she leaned forward and said, "They used you. But it's not over. Not even close. This deed, if filed properly, changes everything. And given the timeline and Walter's intentions, you have a very real chance of restoring ownership." I nodded, tears stinging but never falling. Then she added, "But I need you to be prepared, Ruth. Once we move forward, it will get uglier before it gets better. They'll fight back, especially her." I already knew that. What I didn't know, what I hadn't expected, was how calm I felt. Like I had spent so long walking on glass that finally stepping onto solid ground felt unnatural at first, but deeply right. As I left Mallory's office, the cold October wind rustled the leaves along the sidewalk, and I paused for a moment beneath a tree turning gold. I thought of Walter. I thought of Daniel, once so small he fit in the crook of my arm. I thought of Harper, always watching, always calculating, and then I thought of myself, not the version they tried to push out, but the woman who had rebuilt broken classrooms, nursed sick friends, survived widowhood, and now stood, quietly but firmly, against her own erasure. They hadn't expected me to rise, but I had. And now, They would learn the hardest truth of all. You cannot bury a woman who remembers everything. When I stepped out of Mallory's office that afternoon, with Walter's hidden deed tucked safely in a folder beneath my arm, I felt a steadiness I hadn't known in weeks. It was the quiet kind of strength. Not the kind that makes you want to shout or run, but the kind that makes your spine straighten just a little more, and your gaze stop flickering downward. For so long, I had allowed Harper's dismissiveness and Daniel's silence to shrink me. I had walked on eggshells in my own home, let my voice falter in rooms where I once led entire classrooms. But now, I had proof. I had a plan. And more importantly, I had remembered who I was before they made me question it. Mallory had warned me that filing the deed would be the easy part. The hard part would be what came after. When people like Harper lose control, she said as she gathered her notes, they rarely do it gracefully. I believed her, and I braced myself accordingly. Still, I underestimated how quickly Harper would strike and how low she would go. 3 days later, the call came. It wasn't from Daniel and certainly not from Harper. It was from a woman at the Department of Elder Services. Her voice was courteous but clipped, and I immediately recognized the tone. It was the same one I used to hear from school administrators right before a parent was told their child had been suspended. "We've received an anonymous concern," she said, "regarding your current living situation and emotional stability. As a matter of standard procedure, we'd like to schedule a home visit." I asked her flatly, "Was the concern submitted by a relative?" She paused. "I'm afraid I can't disclose that." But I already knew. This wasn't about concern. This was strategy. Harper had realized I wasn't going to disappear. She had sensed my shift, subtle though it was. And like anyone used to absolute control, she was now trying to destabilize me before I could reclaim ground. By reporting me as a potential danger to myself, she was building a narrative. One where I was confused, unstable, and, most crucially, not fit to handle legal matters or independent living. It wasn't just cruel. It was calculated. Because if I could be framed as mentally unfit, everything I claimed, everything Walter had left me, everything I was fighting for, could be dismissed as the ramblings of an unwell woman. I agreed to the visit, but I didn't panic. Instead, I began preparing, again, not with aggression, but with quiet resolve. I gathered every record I could think of. Medical files from my doctor showing my mental clarity, testimonies from 3 friends I had tutored with at the library. Even a signed statement from the motel manager confirming I had been handling my own affairs, paying my bills, and living independently for the past few weeks without issue. I made copies. I arranged them neatly. And then I waited. The social worker arrived 3 days later. A younger woman, maybe in her early 30s, dressed in a beige trench coat and carrying a leather binder. She was polite but observant, and I could tell she'd been briefed thoroughly. She asked me a series of questions about my medication, my eating habits, my sleep, my daily activities. I answered each one calmly, never once betraying the anger that buzzed just beneath the surface. I knew what this was. And I wasn't about to let Harper make me unravel on cue. I offered her tea. I showed her my bank statements, my prescription list, the paperwork from Mallory, even my calendar with upcoming appointments. I spoke clearly. I smiled when I needed to. And when she finally closed her binder, she said gently, "Miss Ruth, I don't see any cause for concern. But I do think it's important to document that you're being subjected to an ongoing pattern of psychological harassment." There it was. Acknowledgement. After she left, I sat in the armchair in my motel room and let myself breathe, slow, full, and steady. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't imagining things. Harper wasn't simply cold or difficult. She was deliberate. This was abuse, subtle, domestic, dressed in middle-class professionalism, but abuse nonetheless. Later that week, Daniel called. It had been over a month since our last conversation. I stared at his name on the screen for a long moment before answering. When I finally picked up, his voice was hesitant, overly polite, as though he were speaking to a stranger. "Mom, Harper told me about the wellness check. She said you might be confused or lashing out. I closed my eyes, letting his words hit, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed how far gone he truly was. I see, I said. Look, he added, we're not trying to hurt you. We just want everyone to be safe and clear on their roles. If you want to return to the house at some point, we can talk about formalizing something like a rental agreement or cohabitation terms. Terms? I asked, my voice so soft it made him pause. Just guidelines, he said. For structure. I wanted to scream, to ask him where his soul had gone, to remind him of the nights I stayed up with him during fevers, the times I skipped meals to afford his school books, the way I never once asked for rent when he was jobless after college. But I said none of that. Instead, I said something else. Daniel, I loved you more than I loved the sound of my own name. I raised you to be kind, and now I don't recognize you. I don't need structure. I need my dignity, and I'm reclaiming it, with or without your blessing. He didn't reply, just silence. Then a muttered, I hope you find peace. And the line went dead. What he didn't realize was I already had. In the following days, Mallory filed Walter's deed. A formal hearing was scheduled, and a quiet investigation into the elder services complaint was opened. Harper hadn't just overplayed her hand. She had made a legal misstep, and Mallory was already working to document the false report as retaliatory. I wasn't rushing toward revenge. I was building something stronger. Truth that could not be argued away. Facts that held weight. A narrative that Harper could no longer manipulate. But even as the legal case moved forward, I faced a different battle, the one within me. The grief of being cut off, not just from a home, but from a child. There were nights I still cried, not from weakness, but from memory. I miss Daniel, or rather, I miss the boy I used to read bedtime stories to. The boy who once insisted on saving half his Halloween candy for me. That boy no longer existed, and if I kept mourning him, I would never heal. So I stopped waiting for an apology, and I started imagining a life where peace didn't require permission. I began looking at small rental houses on the edge of town. A place with enough space for my books, a little garden, and maybe a sunroom where I could read in the afternoons. I started tutoring again, this time for a single mother whose daughter struggled with dyslexia. I bought myself a proper tea kettle, bright blue, with a handle that didn't squeak. I painted my nails, just once, for no reason other than it made me feel alive. I told myself, you may have been thrown away, but you are not trash. You are soil, and soil grows back stronger. And on one ordinary Thursday morning, as I sat with a fresh cup of tea and the sound of birds just beyond the motel window, a thought occurred to me. Clear, sudden, and undeniable. They had underestimated me. And soon, they would see what happened when a woman they thought was defeated decided to stand tall. Not for revenge, but for reclamation. Because I was no longer just recovering. I was returning. I had always believed that the deepest betrayals happened in private, in quiet rooms, between hushed tones and unspoken disappointments. But I was wrong. Sometimes betrayal parades itself in public, cloaked in charm, dressed in grace, smiling sweetly as it tears you apart. And when it comes from someone who knows exactly which threads to pull, it doesn't just unravel your dignity, it aims to turn others against you. So your shame isn't just felt in silence, but seen in the eyes of people you once called neighbors. That was the shape Harper's next strike took. Not legal filings or anonymous complaints, but public humiliation. Calculated, rehearsed, and designed to isolate me completely before I could stand back up. It began with whispers, the same way all poison spreads. I would enter the grocery store and see heads tilt together, eyes shift in my direction, and voices drop low. At first, I told myself it was paranoia. After all, I had spent weeks in hiding, wrapped in my own grief and paperwork, staying in a motel room instead of my own home. Maybe I was just sensitive. Maybe I was imagining the distance, but then came the messages, cryptic, clipped, and cruel. A woman from church sent me a text that said, "I hope you find peace, whatever you're going through." A former student's mother messaged me on Facebook to say she was disappointed to learn what had really happened, and that the younger generation deserves space to grow without being controlled. Controlled. That word sat in my chest like ice. I had never controlled anything but thermostats and casserole ingredients. But suddenly, I was being painted as a manipulative mother-in-law, the kind who lurked in hallways, listening through walls, clutching deeds and guilt like weapons. The real blow came in the form of a blog post, a personal blog, run by Harper, which until then had mostly been filled with lifestyle fluff, meal prep tips, passive-aggressive parenting quotes, and photos of throw pillows staged like magazine ads. But in one particular post, titled, "When Home Stops Feeling Like Home," she wrote about a difficult season with an aging in-law who refused to respect boundaries, manipulated family dynamics, and created a toxic environment. She didn't name me. She didn't need to. Every reader in town knew exactly who she meant. She described how she and Daniel had finally taken back control of their home after years of emotional dependency and entitlement. She even included a photo of the house with the caption, "A space of healing, finally reclaimed." There, in public, was the narrative she had been building behind closed doors, a curated tale of courage and renewal, with me cast as the antagonist in her story of self-care. I read it in silence, the way you read something so shocking that your brain needs time to catch up. Every line stung, not just because it was laced with half-truths, but because of how effective it was. She hadn't just thrown me out of a house. She was trying to throw me out of my own identity. In a town like ours, perception sticks. You don't need evidence to ruin a reputation, just repetition. And Harper knew how to speak with just enough grace that people didn't question her version. They simply accepted it. I didn't respond, not publicly, not online, not through passive quotes or defensive comments. I knew better than to swim in her waters, where everything could be twisted and rebranded as hysteria. But I didn't retreat either. Instead, I doubled down, not in anger, but in documentation. Mallory and I compiled everything. The note left on my bags, the timeline of events, the fake elder report, the blog post, the messages from others. Every detail added weight to our case. And while the legal process crawled forward, I turned inward, not to wallow, but to rebuild. I left the motel. Not because I was forced to, but because I chose to. I found a rental cottage 2 towns over, small, quiet, with a narrow porch and a patch of sun in the backyard. The landlady, a kind widow named June, had known Walter in passing and offered the space without hesitation. "You remind me of myself 10 years ago," she said, when I handed her the first check. "Only I didn't fight back when they pushed me out. I'm glad you are." I unpacked slowly. I hung Walter's jacket near the door, filled a bookshelf with poetry, placed a tiny vase of wildflowers on the kitchen table. I didn't call it home yet, but it felt safe. And in that safety, I found something else. Purpose. I resumed tutoring, this time offering lessons out of the library. A teenage girl named Lucy came to me one afternoon with a stammer in her voice and a mind sharp as glass. She was failing English, afraid to speak in class, convinced she was stupid. But when I handed her a copy of The Secret Garden and told her that some of the best things grow in silence, she smiled in a way that made my chest ache. She came back every week after that. Others followed. Word spread, not the kind Harper wanted, but the quiet kind. The kind that builds from eye contact, from whispered thank yous, from the silent gratitude of parents who saw their children bloom because of a woman the internet had tried to erase. One afternoon, the head librarian pulled me aside and said, "I don't know what happened at your old place, Ruth, and I don't care. What I do know is every kid that walks out of here after a session with you walks out straighter. They matter more." That became my anchor. Not vindication, not revenge, but meaning. The kind that Harper couldn't steal with a blog post or a whisper. Still, the legal hearing loomed. Mallory warned me that Harper's team was preparing a counterclaim. They'll argue that the deed Walter signed was done under confusion, she said. They'll try to paint you as manipulative and Walter as too sick to know what he was doing. It was textbook and disgusting. But we were ready. We had the dated documents, the notary statement, the nurse's affidavit saying Walter was lucid and specific about wanting the house protected in my name. We had my journal, my files, my timeline, and we had the truth. The night before the hearing, I didn't sleep much. I lit a candle, opened a box of Walter's things, and read his old letter again, the one he had left with the deed. In it he wrote, "If they ever try to push you out, I want you to push back. Not with fists, but with facts. You are the roots of this family, Ruth. Don't let them cut you down without a fight." I whispered into the candlelight. "I won't." And I meant it. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and colder judgment. It was a simple space. Rows of benches worn smooth from decades of people sitting with their hearts in their throats. A judge's bench that towered just high enough to remind you who held the power, and walls painted in that pale beige every government building seems to share. As I stepped into that room, documents pressed close to my chest, and Mallory beside me with her quiet certainty. I realized I had crossed an invisible line. I was no longer just defending a house, or even a name. I was defending the very idea of who I had been all these years. Mother, wife, teacher, protector, and whether all of that could be erased with a smear, a signature, and a cold smile. Harper was already there, seated beside a sharply dressed attorney whose silver cufflinks and polished voice oozed practiced compassion. Her hair was tied in a perfect chignon, and she wore muted pearl earrings, the kind meant to say dignity, without ever needing to speak it aloud. Daniel sat beside her, his shoulders stiff, his eyes trained downward, and his hands clasped together like he was praying the floor might swallow him whole. He didn't look at me. Not once. The judge entered, a middle-aged woman with salt-colored hair pulled back and a voice that was more steel than soft. She opened the proceedings without flourish. No one smiled. No one greeted. We were not here to reconcile. We were here to measure truth against narrative and see which one cracked first. Harper's attorney began. He spoke with the cadence of a seasoned storyteller, laying out their position not with venom, but with veneer. He described Walter's declining health, the vulnerability of old age, and how confusion often accompanies grief in family dynamics. He described me, gently and politely, as once capable, now under strain, and painted the deed Walter had signed as a possible mistake, born not of intention, but of manipulation. The facts, he said, are not in question. What is in question is motive, and we must consider whether the defendant, he gestured toward me without looking, pressured a dying man to act against the best interests of his legacy. It was elegant, it was strategic, and it was utterly wrong. Mallory stood next. She didn't pace. She didn't posture. She let the silence do most of the heavy lifting. Then, in one long clear breath, she delivered the facts. Walter's notarized quitclaim deed, the date, the signature, the letter he had written, the testimony from the notary who'd witnessed it, then the nurse's affidavit, describing Walter's mental clarity and his insistence that the house go to me in case something happens, and finally, my own journal, which mapped a timeline of events with heartbreaking precision, every slight, every incident, every change that proved this was not a misunderstanding, but a slow burn manipulation designed to push me out. When she called me to the stand, I didn't stumble. I didn't weep. I spoke with the kind of clarity that only comes from having nothing left to lose. I told them how I had cooked Harper's meals, stayed up with her during her miscarriage, gifted Daniel partial ownership out of trust, and how I had come home from a hospice visit to find my bags dumped like garbage, and a note demanding rent for the very house I had once built around their comfort. I spoke of Walter, of how he had watched the change in Harper with quiet concern, and how he had left me that envelope not because he distrusted me, but because he trusted me to use it only if I absolutely had to. I said, I'm not here to win a house. I'm here to keep the truth from being rewritten by someone who never knew what it cost to build a life worth protecting. And then Mallory called a surprise witness. I hadn't known she had found him. I hadn't even thought to ask. But when the courtroom doors opened and I saw Ben Carter step inside, the same notary who had signed Walter's final deed, I felt my throat close with shock. He was older now, hunched slightly, but his face was unmistakable. He took the stand, raised his right hand, and told the court under oath that Walter had been lucid, that Walter had called him privately, that Harper and Daniel had been told to wait in the lobby, that Walter had made his intentions clear. This home is my wife's. She's the one who stayed. She's the one who never took. Make sure it stays with her. That moment pierced through Harper's polish like a hammer through porcelain. She flinched, just slightly, but enough. Daniel turned pale. Her attorney objected, claimed the memory could be faulty, that time had passed. But the court allowed the testimony. And when Ben handed over the official logbook entry confirming the meeting, dated and initialed, the judge accepted it into the record without hesitation. What happened next was subtle but seismic. The judge didn't smile. She didn't announce a ruling then and there, but her tone changed. Her questions to Harper's team became more pointed. Her expression less neutral. She asked why, if I was truly unstable, had no formal guardianship proceedings ever been initiated. She questioned the logic of demanding rent from someone who had been providing care and resources in the home for years. She asked about the fake elder services report. Harper's attorney stammered. Harper shifted in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her legs with unnecessary force. Then came the final blow. As the session adjourned for deliberation, Harper made the mistake of speaking loudly as we left the courtroom. She turned to Daniel and said, "She'll be dead in 5 years anyway. Why is this worth the fight?" It wasn't meant to be heard, but it was. The judge had not yet stepped out, and though no one said a word, the tension in the room broke like glass. That afternoon, the judge returned. Her ruling was clear. The quitclaim deed was valid. Walter's intentions were affirmed. The house was mine. Harper and Daniel were ordered to cease all attempts at eviction, harassment, or financial retaliation. Their legal claim was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be filed again. A formal warning was issued regarding the Elder Services report, pending further investigation. And though the ruling didn't erase the pain they caused, it restored the one thing they thought they had destroyed: my right to stand. I left the courthouse slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel every step. Mallory placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did it," she said. But I shook my head. Number, I just remembered who I was. Peace does not arrive with fireworks. It doesn't knock loudly or announce itself like victory often does. Instead, it seeps in slowly, like morning light through curtains you forgot to close. After the courtroom had emptied, after Harper stormed off and Daniel vanished into the hall without a word, after Mallory squeezed my hand and whispered, "They can't take this from you again." I didn't go out for celebration. I didn't toast to winning. I didn't even feel like I'd won anything. I just went home. Not to a house filled with flowers or welcome back signs, but to a quiet cottage with a warm kettle, a folded quilt, and a window that faced the east. It was enough. In fact, it was more than enough. The legal victory brought closure in writing, but healing is a different kind of quiet process. One that doesn't follow a schedule or stick to court orders. I spent the weeks after the ruling tending to the small life I had started piecing together in that little rental cottage. I filled my days with tutoring, gardening, reading, and teaching myself how to bake lemon tarts the way my mother used to. I got to know the rhythm of my new neighborhood, the way the sunlight moved across the floor around 3 p.m., the exact hour the neighbor's orange tabby cat liked to perch outside my porch. I made space for calm, not because I was hiding, but because I had earned it. Daniel didn't call. Not after the ruling, not in the days or weeks that followed. And truthfully, I stopped expecting him to. The mother in me, the part that still remembered the weight of his newborn body in my arms, his laughter echoing through the hallway, his pride when he first learned to tie his shoes, still missed him. but the woman I had become, the one who had survived being discarded, humiliated, and gaslit in her own home, no longer clung to the idea that blood should excuse betrayal. There is no title sacred enough to justify cruelty, not even son. Then, on a late Sunday afternoon in November, just as the maple trees had turned to fire outside my window, there was a knock at my door. I opened it slowly, not out of fear, but out of caution. And there he stood, Daniel. Older, thinner, pale, the man who had once been my boy, now carrying the weight of choices I hadn't made for him. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice cracked as if he hadn't used it in weeks. "Do you have a minute?" I didn't speak right away. I simply opened the door a little wider. He stepped in, took off his shoes without being asked, and sat at my table like he had when he was a teenager, trying to find the words for something he'd done wrong. "I don't know how to apologize," he said. "I don't even know if it matters anymore." I poured us tea, not because I had forgiven him, but because offering someone tea has always been my way of grounding the moment. We sat in silence for several minutes. I didn't rescue him from it. I let him feel it. "Harper's left," he finally said. She moved in with her sister, took the car, the savings, the credit cards, said I let her down by not fighting harder. I sipped my tea. "You did let me down." He nodded, eyes wet. "I know. And I don't think I even realized what was happening until I saw her face when you won. It wasn't anger. It was fear. She was terrified of losing. Not because she wanted the house, but because she wanted the power. And you gave it to her," I said. "Not to hurt him, but because truth is the only path to healing." "I did," he whispered. "And I'm sorry." I didn't say I forgave him. I didn't reach across the table or cry or let it. Years of pain dissolve into one neat conclusion, because life doesn't work that way. What I did say was this: I'm healing, Daniel, not just from what you did, but from all the years I taught myself to stay small so no one else would feel uncomfortable. I won't go back to that. And I won't let you call me Mom and think that's enough. He nodded again. I don't deserve that yet. I wanted you to know. I see it now. I see what she did, what I let her do. We sat for another half hour. He didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't offer it, but we spoke. For the first time in a long time, we spoke like two people who had once known each other in an honest way. I walked him to the door, not with a promise of reconciliation, but with a parting that felt like a new beginning, or at the very least, the closing of a door that had been left open too long. After he left, I lit a candle and stood in my kitchen, surrounded by nothing expensive or curated, but everything meaningful. My books, my favorite tea, the soft hum of the heater Walter had once installed in a weekend. I thought about everything that had happened, about how close I had come to disappearing, not because I lacked strength, but because I kept giving my power to people who mistook silence for weakness. I thought about all the women like me, mothers, widows, caretakers, who gave everything only to be told they were a burden once they stopped being useful. This story was mine, but it was not only mine. To every woman listening, every mother who gave more than she had, every grandmother who stayed quiet so others could feel big, every woman who stood in the doorway of a home she once built and felt like a stranger, you are not invisible. You are not a problem to be solved. You are not meant to shrink so others can shine. Your story matters. Your name matters. And even if they try to take everything from you, remember this: they cannot take your voice. They cannot take your truth. And they cannot take your worth, unless you hand it to them. Thank you for listening to mine. If it made you feel seen, heard, or understood, I hope you'll stay with us here at Shame Stories. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs it, leave a comment if you can. Let your story ripple into someone else's courage. Till then, I'll be right here, rooted, rising, and finally, fully home.